guest is an outstanding speaker and thought leader in the area of ownership and accountability and the functional linkages to your enterprise operating system. So I'd like to welcome Thom Keehan. Thom is currently the founder and management partner of Enterprise Kaizen, a newly formed company focused on recoveries, turnarounds, and transformations. Prior to this, Thom held a variety of vice president roles for Johnson Controls, Tenneco, and Daikin Applied, focused on operations, transformations, and the full suite of operational excellence. He has been involved in many forms of operational excellence since 1995, including leading the Lean Office initiatives for GE between 2002 and 2005, which connected both the Lean Manufacturing and Six Sigma initiatives to form a holistic enterprise Lean Six Sigma approach. Thom has run several small and large-scale implementations of recoveries, turnarounds, and transformations, and is passionate about enterprise architecture as he believes it is a foundational component to business excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, Thom Keehan.
Great, thank you, Jose. I appreciate it. Nice introduction and very well. Always to have someone introduce you, it makes you feel good about what you've done. As Jose said, the thing that I tend to be very passionate about is looking at the enterprise architecture of what your business system or your operating system does for you. One of the most critical aspects of it that I've experienced over the last many years doing these is how you can link the different functions that are involved in your business system together. And I kind of put it together as ownership and accountability. And once you have ownership and accountability, it really keeps those functions together and it connects them with measurements and processes that are so important to have your business system always moving through the maturity model that you put in place. So to start with, the way that I've always looked at it, kind of an enterprise approach, is that you're creating an enterprise plan for the company. So that means you're most likely trying to grow, you're trying to add more time with capacity, using strategy deployment to connect the strategic plan to the actual operating model that you have, how to keep yourself operationally excellent using operational excellence and lean methodologies and all the continuous improvement and business process improvements. And then really having your employees engaged. They've got to understand, first of all, why you're making the changes that you are, and then how you get them engaged and help them move into the acceptance of what you're trying to do. And very importantly, have a process to manage people through the transition state. So the opportunity to identify your current state and your future state, but that transition state to go from one to the other is very important. So the objectives that I always think about as I go through an enterprise operating system and the approach is really threefold. It's really looking at what you currently do and enhancing it, and then extending it across the rest of the company. Always consider building for your future. So what is it that you need to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, depending on the pace of your products and how they match to the pace of your customers. And then always making sure that you're managing to a cost-effective culture. And I say those words very particularly because a cost reduction or a cost down can sometimes put you into a perilous position. So creating a cost-effective culture is very important. So that threefold kind of approach, very important. And then thinking about how do we then take that and make it into a lean enterprise, right? So that enhancing, extending the current capabilities, making sure that the people understand, first of all, what your opportunities are, how you go and achieve those improvements, both in your products, your processes, but also adding into the services and then the information that goes across your company. Building for the future, that's the maximization of shareholder value, capitalizing on creating partnerships and loyalty with your customer base, so that you have a value-driven solution that's end-to-end across, and always maintaining that pace of your customer to keep them ahead of the competition. And then creating that cost-effective culture, always achieving business-critical results at greater speed and lower cost. And I talk a lot about optimum cost, because the way your cost structure works inside your company is very much like inventory. Too much is no good, too little is no good. So the optimization of that is quite critical. The strategic process that I look at and I manage through in developing any kind of enterprise architectural plan, first of all, starts with, the strategic plan. So that's your strategy, that you got to make sure you have the vision, you have the right mission, and you have the right plan in place of what you're trying to achieve 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now. Once you have that strategic plan, it's about looking at your organization and designing it so that it is effectively able to execute the plan based on the strategic plan. So that organizational design and development is a very important part of it, because sometimes that changes how you actually have your organization set out. And then the operating model that your company works across. So it's about the application and the governance of how things flow from input to output across every portion of your business. And then, of course, using strategy deployment, the Hoshin Connery, Hoshin planning, you have the focus and alignment that is directly tied to that strategic plan. So it all tends to flow right back through. And then, of course, the visibility and transparency that you need to have to make sure everybody understands what they're working on, why they're working on it, and the whole enterprise plan is cohesive enough for everybody to understand. Remember that why that I talked about earlier, and then going right back into the strategic planning process as an update every year. So it's a refreshing cycle that goes through time and time again. That operating model that we talked about on the previous page, very important. So this is an operating model that I developed as what I call a concept to cash value stream. So you have input for customers on the type of market to product flow that you need to have, and that's what your sales and commercial operations are working on. And then once you have that product in mind, turning it into the product development and launch value stream, so that you go from product to launch with the right execution, and you have the right commercial or customer requirements that are turned into the technical requirements that then move into the next value stream of order to ship. And this is how the bill of materials then flows its way through. And then, of course, the ship to delivery back to the customers. So this closed loop process is really about creating the optimum speed and predictability for your operating model, with many of the other areas of the business, the rest of the business, really supporting in every aspect that you do. So creating that right operating model is very, very important, because it becomes the blueprint of how your enterprise architecture system really works in regards for driving that growth with your customers. So to get to the fundamental part of it and understanding where that ownership and accountability is, that operating model for each one of those areas then has core competencies or processes that are the fundamentals that should be there in each one of your functional areas. So if I go to the sales and commercial operations, these are the processes that should be there, right? The sales management process, your customer relationship management, demand forecasting, and identifying for your company what those core competencies and processes are in each one of the areas of your operating model. And then using this to then decide, how do I connect functionally from one to the other, is really so important, because that's what binds the enterprise architecture or the enterprise approach together. So as you can read through many of these, you can start to see where they apply to the others. If you think about design for manufacturing and the manufacturing operations segment, that directly ties to many of the product development and launch core competencies. And then where that foundational and back office work tends to happen with finance and human resources and IT and legal, driven by the continuous improvement methods to constantly improve you as you go forward. So these core competencies or processes of your operating system are really critical to identify and put in place. And once you've identified what the ones are, you start to see the linkages. So if I take just sales and commercial operations, I left in bold so that you can see the processes and the other areas or the other elements of that operating model of where they connect to. So the sales and commercial operations, obviously for new technology introduction that you're trying to put into your customer base or to have you ahead of your competition. And then having that program management and launch system effectively take your new product introduction or your sustaining engineering projects that you need to move the way through. In manufacturing operations, having a safe workplace for your environment is not just about the manufacturing organizations, but it's about, where all of your employees are actually working. And that's, whether they're a salesperson in the car, on the road, all the way to the office environment into the manufacturing operations as well. Then to integrated supply chain, one of my favorite connections is the sales and commercial operations is demand forecasting into the sales and operations planning that you see. And that's kind of the beginning of ownership and accountability. The sales and operations planning is owned by the integrated supply chain, sometimes the manufacturing operations, but where it's held accountable is in the demand forecast that's generated into the sales and operations planning element. Once you have those core competencies identified, you start to put the definitions that you need behind each one of them so that as you develop them, each one of the other areas can see what that structural definition is of how we need to approach it. So the sales management process, as an example, a structured approach for commercial strategic planning, sales management, and profitable growth. The sales management process also has a phase gate that it goes through, from discovery all the way through quote, award, and deliver. So that's where we need to make sure we have the right definitions in place. And then, of course, how do we then put the right measurements in place on those processes so that we know exactly how they're performing and what we need to do to get better? So a nice format that I've used in the past is, what is that competency? What's the operational definition? What's the metric that we're going to use to measure it? One metric, it might have many variables inside of it, but what's that one metric we can count on to really be the signal that says, this is how we're performing, what our target would be. And your target needs to be, very analytical. It needs to look at what's your current performance, what's the capability of the process, and then what's the entitlement. And that entitlement is, I did it once before, so that's essentially the stretch target that I could have. But target setting is an important part, because as you move through the maturity model of your core competencies, you need to make sure that you're setting achievable targets along the way as you go. And then, of course, deciding, do I currently measure it or not yet, and I need to work on it and I need to have it on. The important thing is to continue moving as an evolution to have this delivered. How am I performing? And then, of course, what's the trend of the previous quarter versus the current quarter, or week or month or half year, however you want to measure it. Then you want to take it and say, okay, now I'm going to put together a maturity model. How do I take it from where it currently exists and move my way through the different levels that says I can make it to the right level? So we then start to look at product development and launch, and we have the connections in there. And the one I talked about before in manufacturing operations was that design for manufacturing. That's such an important aspect that we need to look at, is that design for manufacturing, design for serviceability, design for recycling. There's a lot of aspects in there that we need to take back into the development of the core competencies or processes in other areas. But again, you can see how there's connections across all of these from product development and launch. And again, we decide what the definitions are across those core competencies. And then moving into manufacturing operations, it's the exact same process that we go through. And this is the one where we tend to see things the most visible, is in our manufacturing operations. That's where our product or our service actually comes to shape, where we can see what it is that we're delivering to the customers. And then, of course, as we go through the competencies and the definitions and get to that last one, which is the integrated supply chain, to say, okay, then this is where I'm actually delivering to my customer. So how is it that I affect all the other core competencies across the system? So these key linkages are very important. The step that you would go through is then to say, okay, now for the operating model, how do I execute it? Well, we talked about the measurements of those processes and those core competencies. So first of all, I want to think, what are those principles that I have and what are the areas of focus? And those three that I referenced at the beginning, which is how do we enhance and extend our current capabilities? You know, so it's not, you know, it's rough sometimes when you're in there and you say, we got to get better. That doesn't mean it's bad now. It means we're trying to enhance what's currently done. So don't ignore the work that was done before. That's a very critical point. How do we know that that's going to actually make us have something that we're building on for our future and for our growth, and then that creating the cost-effective culture? Now, from that, in that operating model, we had those four main areas of sales and commercial operations, the product development and launch. So how do I put together a transfer function? And the transfer function is simply defined as Y equals a function of X. So if I look at operating profit as the Y, those 4 or 5 variables that I have are going to affect my operating profit. And this is a great way to start to build your metric tree that you can start to measure all of these different areas across your system that you have going across the business. And then, of course, those business transfer functions are your leading indicators of performance. So this is start to become the predictability of how I take it through. And this is where you can start to say, how do I start to bring in any kind of automation, any kind of system that I can manage, because I can measure it accurately. So I've got to define the process first. I've got to build the process first. And once I can measure it, then I can start talking about any kind of systematic approach or any kind of automated system to do that. And then from the top down of the business, we look at executing the business at the Y level, meaning the big ones that we have, the big measurements that we use across the different functions to create those linkages. So we think about customer loyalty, the growth that we have, either by operating income, margin, EBITDA, product development lead time at the customer's pace. So are we moving at the same pace as our customer so that we can keep in tandem with how we work across with them? On-time delivery, quality, and then cash on hand. How do I keep all that visible? And then the next level down, if my customer loyalty is poor, it could be that my issue resolution cycle time is very bad. And I might have, 90% of my issue resolution happening within 24 to 48 hours or whatever your pace needs to be. But we really got to make sure we're looking at that tail, the 95th percentile and beyond of your data, to make sure that you're not ignoring customers on a regular basis that are 2 weeks, 3 weeks out before their issues are being resolved. So as we look through those X's, they definitely work into how am I moving the big whys of my operating model. And then, of course, thinking about the operational cadence of how you operate. So whether you're monthly, quarterly, or annually, you've got different metrics and you've got different measurement system for that type of cadence. So the monthly is very important. We tend to see that as an annual operating rhythm. But then are you looking at your quarterly performance for your strategy deployment breakthrough objectives? And then annually, what are you doing to refresh your strategic plan and your strategy deployment as you go through the business? So as an example, being able to connect them, if we think about product development lead time in that product development and launch part of the value stream of the operating model, we think about how well am I going through my phase gates of the new product introduction process or the program management process. So we think about the first pass yield that we have going through, which is a wonderful quality metric because it lets you know how you're operating as a full-on system. What's the program cycle time that I have for each one of my products that I put through the system? The amount of time that I have in engineering that I've applied to those programs, the number of changes post-design freeze. And this is one of my favorites because we think that we don't do very many of them, and then you start to measure them and you find out that you do quite a bit. And if you think about how that affects into the manufacturing operations as late changes, drawings that need to be updated, or your engineering change orders that you have to push through, this is one that causes a lot of that waste inside your system. Those directly link down to that manufacturing operations big Y of the order to ship lead time. And again, that first one is, how do I make sure that I'm keeping a safe workplace for my employees? How's the environmental management that I have? Am I got my permits all in line? Am I operating the way I'm meant to? Then your operational excellence is, what are the month-over-month improvements that we're making using all this operational excellence, and moving on through. So if the product development lead time for the product development and launch value stream of the operating model, you can see where that would tie straight into design for manufacturing. That's the connection. So the ownership on-time launch starts, that happens to fall on manufacturing operations quite a bit. The accountability on that is one step earlier, which is in that product development lead time shown by those measurements that you have, X1 through X7. So again, thinking about it, and I mentioned this one at the very beginning, when I always think about where the easiest one to explain to people is that sales and operations planning, or your production, sales, and inventory, however you have that process laid out, that's where the ownership occurs. But you can see how I can link all the way back to the beginning of the presentation, beginning of the operating model, I'm sorry, on where the demand forecasting has, and that is where the accountability is. And when you set those metrics up, like we used on the previous page as an example, that's what brings the teams together, and that's what shows, a lot more in plans. If my sales and operations planning, I'm at a 17% forecasting error, what is the demand forecast that we had in there that fed that caused that type of variation that I have? So once you can start to operate very predictably through all of these, then you can start to really, really refine what your enterprise architecture looks like, and you can start to apply a lot of the tools or systems that are really helpful out there for us right now to manage these as a much quicker pace, more effectively, and the visibility and the transparency across the company becomes much broader and much more visible for the rest of the employees. So going back to it, thinking about what an enterprise architecture is meant to do, again, I'm going to repeat it. It's that really looking at what you currently do, how do I enhance it? How do I extend it across the rest of the company? And then how do I make sure that all those processes and all those measurements and the measurement systems that I have in there are solid enough and structured enough that I can start to either put it into any kind of system, or I can put it into any kind of automation where I can feel comfortable enough that it's going to perform as designed, making sure that the future of what our company is moving towards, and we're building, for that growth along with our customer base to stay ahead of our competition, and then making sure we're able to continue and survive our way through it by creating a cost-effective culture as we go through. So I appreciate all the time. I went through that probably a little quicker than I went to. When you don't have that live audience asking you questions along the way, you tend to go a little bit faster. But I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I'm going to go back to Jose and see if we can answer some of the questions might have come through.
Very well, Thom. Very well. Thank you. There are questions that came in as you're speaking. So so there's a commentary here that you cover kind of like the back to basics from strategic planning, operational planning, which is helpful to a lot of organizations, because there's so much talk about technology and architecture, and it's easy to lose sight of the fundamentals, right? And the fundamentals are very important. The question is specifically on an enterprise architecture and a bit more focus on technological implementations in the organization. How do you get the system that you just described and you match that against an environment where there's a lot of technological change going on? And how do organizations screen, triage, and bring in those new technologies that align with a strategic planning process like the one you just mentioned?
Yeah, it's a really important part to fully analyze before you do it, Jose. The one thing that I remember finding in previous work assignments was we were automating a lot of our processes that currently existed. And we were putting them such that once we have them automated, we have them visible, then we can work to fix them. The issue is there was a lot of re-engineering that needed to happen to those processes. So you have to be just so careful that you're not using a system to try and fix the process. The system is there to manage the process for you and to make it visible and manipulate further, but the system is not meant to force your process into something that it's currently not. So one of the common mistakes I've seen is really saying if we can just put it into the system and automate it, it'll get so much better, when in fact you have to actually do a lot of the hands-on re-engineering work of those processes to make sure they're structured properly and they're effectively managing what you want them to manage before you start putting them into systems or other architecture automations.
Very good, very good. The next question here has to do with the current affairs. How have you how has the impact of the pandemic and and everything that's going on in 2020 affected the way that organizations are doing their strategic planning process and the way they're executing on that? And there is a joke going on right now that it's like an old quote from John Lennon that I had plans but life happened becomes now I had plans but a pandemic happened. So there were some amazing strategic plans and operating plans that were in place, and somewhere in the first quarter of 2020 they were tossed away and a new reality sets in. What are you seeing in the marketplace with organizations that are having to redo a lot of that work in a very short period of time?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Joseph, because I found one of my slides from like 1999, and one of the things to try to get people going into this new journey that we had for lean and other ones was, if you don't have a crisis, create one, and that'll help you move through it. So obviously we've got a crisis that we don't want, that is forcing us to really do things in a different way. And it's not so much differently, but it's really in a different way. So obviously the way to use things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and in a more effective way has been powerful. So you have to kind of pare down the number of people that you might have on it, but we have been in previous work, we have been able to put together the strategic planning sessions through Microsoft Teams. Let's just use as an example. But you've got to be very specific on the amount of time and what you're going to have accomplished. And you have to do it in smaller pieces, but more frequently. Whereas we used to have, larger meetings for 3 days at a time, this month, next month, and then our strategic plan is done. So now it's probably more like 15 sessions of 2 to 3 hours with fewer people. And then incorporating other people as you go. So as you move through this type of crisis with the type of technology that we got to move now to do it, I would say more events more frequently is really the successful approach to get it done.
And kudos to our audience here, because as we're talking, there are more questions coming in. So I'm gonna pick a few of them. Keep your questions going for Thom here. We have some time, so let's use that time effectively. So the question comes from Anand Sampath, and Anand wants to know, what are your suggestions to create a cost-effective culture?
Yeah, the first one is to not be afraid to put out there what your current cost metrics are. That's it. And creating more of a culture of red, meaning red means help. It does not mean you're doing poorly. It means I am off target and I need help to do it. So a cost-effective culture is looking at everything you do. It's so easy to look at product cost or people cost. But if you look into the line item in your financials of, SG&A as a % of sales, you can start to see where you have a lot of opportunities with indirect costs, external, resources, professional services, utilities. This is the time to really look at it from a, what do I truly need to operate? And then you have to say, okay, to do that, I must have this amount that I use to spend to run this company. And you have to operate around that. And then once you get that variation around that reduced, you can control it by moving it around, just like you would any kind of variation reduction around the mean. But identifying where all the costs are that you can't control, and then the costs that you can control, helps you to really look at it a little bit more effectively and understand what are the real variables that I can start to play with. One of the things I remember looking at for SG&A is the first two line items are, employee salary and benefits, and then the compensation plan right below that. Those are eliminated. I'm not doing anything about that. I want to look at the other 19 items that are below there, and some of those ones further down the Pareto actually have a bigger effect on things higher up the Pareto. So you have to do it a little bit more methodically as you go through, and that's really my recommendation, is to not just focus on the visible, you also have to focus on what's not so visible to you as you look at it.
Thom, that's easy to miss your commentary. It's easy to miss the depth of that commentary unless you have lived through a lot of organizations at a very deep, at a much deeper level. I'll just illustrate that I worked in a very large infrastructure company before, where again it's a really nice play between technology and this discussion about creating a cost-effective culture. They were in one side, the folks on enterprise architecture are talking about all these new technologies that the engineers could use to do their projects, which is true, which is good. And some of these technologies are about becoming more cost efficient. Wonderful. But a fundamental issue underneath, much deeper than the technological issue, was the fact that the engineers, when they designed these billion-dollar infrastructure projects, they had no access to cost data as they were doing the design. Yeah. So I think from a naive standpoint, and I'll say this to our enterprise architecture heavy folks, there is this perception sometimes from that group that the business has access to this information and they should be thinking about what's next in terms of AI, in terms of robotics, process automation. But the reality is that you get close to the troops and you realize that they don't have the fundamentals in place and they don't have access to cost information. And if you just open the books and allow them to see how much some of their designs cost, they would significantly change their designs. Yeah. Again, this seems like such a fundamental common sense things, but leaders like you who have been deep in the trenches, you know that common sense is the least common of the senses in large organizations. And these things sometimes do not happen. So I think back to your comment on creating this cost-effective culture and creating this transparency, for the folks in the audience right now, do not take that transparency for granted, because it's not there in most organizations.
Yeah, I think one of the best things that happened to me from this cost-effective culture approach was when I first started my career with GE in 1993. As an engineer, I needed to know the cost of every part that I was putting into these appliances, because the appliances business is not a high margin business. So as an engineer, I knew all the cost of my parts. I will say that that is not a common thing to find across many other businesses. And just having that as the structure that I had to go through made me look at everything from how are we doing it in accounts payables? What is the cost that it is to process each invoice through the accounts payables process? Figure out what that is. If it's 17 cents per invoice, then how can I make it 16 cents? How can I make it 15 cents without damaging the ability or the capability to do the process? So you got to be very careful as you do this. And this is what, I refer to as when you have a cost down initiative, sometimes that can really impact and hurt your business. So, I think Seth Godin is one of the ones that talked about the race to the bottom when it comes to costing your way out of business. So it's very important to understand what capabilities you need to operate, and then figure out how do I then look at my total costs across the enterprise and manage them more effectively. And it's everywhere. It's not just in the visible part. That's what I mentioned before. It's in the parts that you don't typically see or you don't think it's something you should look at. And I started looking at accounts payables back in 2002, and there was quite a lot of cost opportunity in there as well.
Our next question here comes from Rula O'Day, and Rula asks, how do you get input and buy-in to your metric tree from teams across the organization? How do you get that input to settle on those metrics?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Okay, that is not one of the easier ones to do, because if you haven't been measuring something, people don't always like for it to be measured. So the creation of a balanced scorecard is really important, because by creating the balanced scorecard, you're connecting all the functions together, and they start to understand how those measurements affect their measurements as well. So if we just start at the very beginning with sales and commercial operations, and your first metric is the quality of the orders that I take, meaning how many orders do I have to rework? Obviously, that starts to cut the amount of planning time as you go through the whole value stream. And when you start to see it affect how much time I have in engineering to get my work done, how much work I have in manufacturing to plan and get the machines and actually make the product to ship, it really is a huge help. So a lot of times when I found resistance on that, it's about working more one-on-one with the functional leaders to understand, hey, this is how the whole thing works. If we put your data in there right now, look at the trailing effect across. But when you get a balanced scorecard on one page and you can see red or green, and you see red at the top and you do nothing about it, that red will flow all the way through to the very end, which is where you hit your customer. So really, you need to be that advocate for that customer across that balanced scorecard and make sure you're able to do things about it, mitigate it at the very beginning of the process. But working one-on-one first, so people understand how the full balanced scorecard works, is very important.
The next question is about the roadblocks to implementing ownership and accountability. As you are doing the implementation, what have you experienced to be the major roadblocks to creating this ownership and accountability?
I think one of the roadblocks is when someone is exempt from being part of the enterprise. So of course, you always find a part of the business where the performance is going really well, right? And don't bother that person. They're making money for us right now. They're doing just fine. That can be a significant roadblock, because it means you don't have the enterprise, the holistic view connected. And those roadblocks are very important to expose and to do something about. So that's one of the first ones. One of the other roadblocks is where you find a lot of processes that are not documented, that they just happen to operate on their own. And it's very important to put them down on paper. One of the good methodologies to follow is the SIPOC or the COPUS method, and those middle three things, which is input to the processes and understanding your expected output. If you can make that clear and start getting the core processes defined in the SIPOC, that also really helps reduce a lot of roadblocks, because people can start to see what it is that they're working on. And once people can see what it is that they're working on, the acceptance of making any kind of change is much higher.
This excellent point you have just made on those core processes and competencies, and that's a segue for the next question here. How did you come up with those core processes that you discussed in your presentation in particular? How did those come about as core processes?
Yeah, so those were developed over the past about 10 to 12 years as the processes that I saw in each one of the functions. You can get, depending on the type of business you have and the type of product or the type of industry, sometimes those core processes change, but not significantly. If you think about engineering in the product development and launch, there's always a program management process that you're going through, whether it's a very rigid, structured phase gate process all the way through, or you're just working through different stages as you go. And those are the ones that I found that really need to be there in order for a business to operate very effectively. Okay, so what I'll do is I take that, and if I go into another business or I go to a joint venture or another company, I kind of lay that on top and find out where are the gaps that we have inside of there that need to be structured up and visible. So that's just over the past 10 to 12 years of really seeing what the processes are that need to be in place for that operating model to flow as a value stream from concept to cash.
Very good. Thom, it's a real pleasure to listen to your expertise and have your insights on the implementation of systems like this. So very grateful to have you with us. Thank you for allowing us to listen and learn with you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jose. I appreciate the opportunity.
Very well. Ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up day 2 of Enterprise Architecture Live. As you know, you can provide feedback as you close the session window, and we look forward to meeting you again tomorrow. We have a tremendous sessions with global leaders of enterprise architecture and real practitioners. We have MetLife, Lego, and others tomorrow that will add their perspectives to our enterprise architecture journey and the insights that we all can benefit from. So as you know, you can follow up on later on today and post your comments on LinkedIn. The discussion goes on and we will answer to as many of those as possible. And we hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great day.